Welcome back to Fitness or Fiction, a podcast dedicated to cutting through the hype of the health and fitness industry.
Every week, we dig into a new topic and help you wade through the real information to make solid decisions on your fitness journey.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I think what we need to talk about is it's a mindset shift. And getting into the research on this stuff, if you were wondering, like, well, what is the right answer? The right answer is learning how to use your tissues. Mm-hmm. It's not one of these things where it's like, well, I found this therapy that works, I found that therapy that works. Even if it does work, the long-term solution, really the only thing that's long-term backed, it's not a therapy, it's not an intervention, it is quite literally learning to move your body under control.
Yeah.
So a lot of my back pain people, they just slap around into other positions really quick. And usually it's because in their history, they've been an athlete. And as the function of those joints has changed, they do that. They don't have the stability to do it. So, So anyways, what's the real answer? What would you say the real answer is when it's like, okay, the three big questions. How do I warm up? What do I do for exercise? How do I cool down? If I want my joints to be happy, what's your answer? It's a big question, right? Let's start with how do I warm up?
Yeah.
What would you say? So we went over a lot of stuff that was like, this will decrease your actual performance. So what would you do for a warm-up?
Statically stretch.
You're trying to hurt me. You've been sitting with me for this and you haven't been listening?
Yeah, well, doing like a general warm-up is something that I want to discuss on a completely separate episode because I think that's a whole topic in itself. But yeah, I wouldn't really tell somebody to do static stretching, but I think there's a little bit of value to getting your heart rate up, and then depending on what your exercise looks that day, I think you need to choose some more dynamic and controlled exercises that are going to complement that day specifically, rather than just like doing bench press day, so I'm going to do the world's greatest stretch for my hips and like things like that.
Totally, yeah. I think the right answer, as right as we can get for warm up, is get yourself prepared for the positions we're going to be in and the qualities that you need that day.
Yeah.
So when people say, well, what, you don't stretch? Well, no, listen, if I'm going to be doing squatting and my ankles are a little stiff, I'll do a lot of things with my ankles to get them where I need them to be. Mm-hmm. But if my ankles are doing what I need, I'm not going to stretch anything. I'm going to leave that and I'm going to use it and increase the intensity slowly and get to where I'm going. And I've said a lot of times in my entire weightlifting career, I did very little stretching.
Yeah.
I would take a bar, I'd hold it over my head, I'd drop into the bottom of a squat, I'd get comfortable with the positions I was going to use, and then I'd start loading up weights. Mm-hmm. Like, well, you didn't go for a run first? I'm like, well, that's not really specific to weightlifting. It's really not.
Yeah.
Like, if I was cold, I might do some skipping or something, or ride a bike, if I was cold. But as far as warm-up goes, just because there's research that says it'll decrease your performance, does that matter for Joe Blow that's going in to do a workout? No, and a lot of the protocols that they use are like these long drawn-out stretches. So no, it doesn't have to be that impactful for Joe Blow. But what I would say is, check in on your body. What ranges are you going to use? Are those available today? And let's start building the qualities that you're going to use. If you're using something ballistic, you might want to start with some low-level stuff and get more and more ballistic as you go. Mm-hmm. So is there anything you'd add to that?
No.
So general mobility training. What do you... In your view, general mobility training, what's the best thing to do to make sure that you are maintaining mobility?
Well, you have to use the ranges that you already have.
Yeah,
and
buddy.
Use them fully.
Love it.
That's the general mobility, I guess.
We're petting the same dog. I love it. Is there anything else you would add to that?
I don't know what you want me to add. Like, what do you want me to add?
I don't want you to add anything.
Is this a quiz?
Yeah, it is. It's pop quiz.
Pop quiz.
It's a pop Quiznos. That's from 21 Jump Street. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. It's generally use them with the range that you have. And then I also think that you need to identify if you even need more mobility in certain areas. Like, why are you just chasing excess mobility for the sake of having it for no reason that you don't need it?
Yeah, one of my favorite statements from functional range conditioning certification. That course is very misrepresented online a lot because people are just showing these like fancy ranges that they've achieved and stuff. And that's fine. But Andrea Ospina, the guy who made the course, stood up in front of us and he's like, listen, I don't make bendy blanks. What I do is I make beasts. I don't care if they have more range beyond what they need. I'm trying to give them the range that they've required, that we've identified they need. We're not just doing it for random. We're trying to identify what their range is that they require, and then we're making them super strong in that range, all the way to the end range, as flat as we can make that. We're never going to have a flat line as far as control, but I want to try to make it so that the entire range is well controlled, super strong, and that's going to elicit better performances and more safety.
Yeah.
So there's some really interesting research. We've tried to keep this relatively focused on research and articles that actually back up what we're talking about, because I really don't like the concept of just kind of spouting opinions, because the opinions can be worth not very much. Some opinions are worth more than others, fair. But at the end of the day, when we look at what the body responds well to, if we're going to be doing mobility training, you get to a range and you're like, oh man, I don't have as much range as I need here. So the first step is, well, you know what? I need to get that range. So something to understand is that you're always going to have a slight gap between what you can do passively and actively. We want that gap to be pretty small, but you're always going to have that gap. So if you want a new range, you're going to have to work on getting that passively first.
Yeah.
Then we're going to have to go through a process to create active range there. So there's a nice clean process that you can use. And we've got a study up here that talks about the altered neuromuscular function due to eccentrics. And I have another one on isometrics, where it talks about muscle activations totally different at different lengths and different positions, even at knee flexion. And this is stuff that's really good to know, because okay, I have this passive range. I've established the passive range. That's really what static stretching is good for. You identify a range, that'll help you get there. Fine. Add contractions, it'll be faster and better. Fine. Isometric contractions are what's going to lay down the foundation for awareness and for control in that position. After that, you'd start doing small eccentrics, larger eccentrics, and then you'd start adding concentrics, meaning moving to that space yourself. And then add challenge. That process is so simple. Actually executing it's harder, but really when it comes down to mobility, I think it's a bad thing to say, well, here's all the limitations of what's out there, without saying, you know what, here's a good way of going about it.
I think executing it, like you said, is actually way harder than people anticipate, because people have this preconceived notion that when they're chasing mobility or flexibility, that they just get that nice static relaxing sensation, like, to hold a hamstring stretch isn't that intensive. But when you try to get into your hamstring stretch and then try to use your hip flexor to pull it even more, all of a sudden it turns into work versus the relaxing sensation of just stretching.
Yeah, and this really comes back to training in general. The effort that you're willing to put into something is usually proportionate to what you're going to get out of it. Is that a fair statement to make?
I think so.
I've had a lot of people come to Joint Level Strength, the Zoom class that I run twice a week, and they've said, that is not a stretching class. I'm like, I know. We use stretching, but it's not the mainstay. It is a challenging class because it's joint strength.
Yeah.
Meaning you're going to be working hard to get things you don't have. And when you have ranges that you don't have and you're contracting to get into them, man, it's a game changer. So anyways, the long and the short of it here, we could talk for a long time on this, and maybe we'll talk more on it depending on what people want to hear about it. But the long and short on mobility training is, if you're not teaching your brain how to control those tissues, there's no therapy on earth that's going to make that get completely as good as it's going to be. What's going to be the answer is invariably, are you willing to put in the work to get that range back?
Yeah. And
by that range back, I'm not talking just getting there. I'm talking having control to get there, move through it, and stabilize there. So really, this is a long topic. We've taken a long time to talk about different aspects of it. And you know what? We can probably talk about 3 sections of it more in the future, which is, what should warm-up look like? What should cool down look like? And what should my actual training look like to protect these ranges and make sure that I'm working within where my joint should. But the end of the day, execution plays a huge role as well.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 of the best courses that I've ever taken in N1 and FRC, N1 talks about how do you target each muscle and how does the biomechanics actually change the way that you train. And then FRC talks about, okay, well, here's how we're going to get more range if you need it, but here's how you go about it. Here's the system that you use to create control and strength in those zones.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the next one that I'm taking is FRA, and that's talking more about assessing where a joint's at and what it needs, which I think is highly impactful.
So if we break this down simplistically for some people, say like people who do shorter ranges, like are only like half contractions on exercise. Say if some guy's doing a pull-up, but he's only doing, like the half pull-ups, like just kind of the top half or his strong half, because if he goes all the way down into a relaxed dead hang, that he's not going to have the juice. Like that's it. That's the discrepancy between his passive and active, right? Like he can passively sit in a dead hang, but he doesn't have the active strength to pull out of it and get back into that top half strong range. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, let's say that, my hamstrings aren't very flexible. It's like, okay, well, there's a lot of reasons why that could be the case. And the biggest thing to understand is that it's typically the joint on one or the other side saying, listen, keep those tight because I need the control.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to improve range or you need a range, you've identified that you need it for something that you do, figuring out how to actively get there is key. And, in a lot of ways, getting there passively first. If you can get there, perfect. Next thing is isometric, so squeeze the muscle. Next thing is set that up so that it's challenging and you can lower into the position you need, and then start lifting out and lowering back in and turning it into a full-on exercise.
Yeah. And then in the same breath of like, let's just continue down this chin-up path. If some guy's essentially just pumping the top half of his chin-ups, that's not necessarily going to make that whole structure tighter per se. He's just strengthening that one specific range. It's not tightening him up. Like if you did half range bicep curls, you're not jacking your bicep up so it's tighter tissue. It's more just like you're just not gaining the strength that's going to unlock those ranges at those longer end range.
Yeah, absolutely. It's building a comfort zone, and you're going to go towards your comfort zone. We know this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily that person's going to tighten up, but it's going to be, if he's hanging, guess where he's going to choose to be. So it's one of these games where, partial ranges aren't bad, especially if you're training both ends. Partial ranges are actually incredibly useful.
Mm-hmm.
But you should be training the muscle in its full range. And the full range of the lat is really, the chin-up would be a bad example on that one. It would be like rhomboids in there, lats at the very bottom maybe. But, the big thing that we'd look at is, if you're trying to get length out of that muscle, what does the muscle actually do? Mm-hmm. And that's when having a coach is super valuable. That's when it starts getting to be a little bit more challenging, because a lot of the pull downs and things that you see people doing for their lats are really not working the lat very well.
Yeah. So let's take another example then. Let's say like a stiff leg or a straight leg deadlift.
Yeah.
So just a barbell stiff leg deadlift. When I'm coaching that, like I think everybody has a different stiff leg range, because everyone has different variability in the tightness of their hamstring or when they reach that like tight sensation. So, somebody who has extremely flexible hamstrings and very and strong in that range too, because they can access it, right? Like if somebody's doing like 3 sets of 10 of a straight leg deadlift and they're going all the way down to their maximum ability and like they feel their hamstrings stretch, essentially that's strengthening that end range that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and that's positionally dependent again, but in a Romanian deadlift, if you identify the range you're looking for, you want to see full flexion of the hip.
Mm-hmm.
So most people will have to bend their knees to get into the full flexion of the hip. And then you really want to make sure that person is accessing the hamstring and the meat of the hamstring, which is higher up towards the glute. When they feel the stretch just down by the knee, that's tendinous.
Yeah.
So, but it's the exact thing we're talking about. We want to address that tissue in its full length, right?
And I'm just kind of talking shop now, even though we're still talking mobility, but just talking shop around mobility. The article that we were reading the same article on eccentrics, and it's talking about how, to my knowledge, it was talking about how eccentric loading or negative loading essentially kind of, it works the brain differently than a concentric lift. So doing the positive versus the negative works the brain a little bit differently. and they were talking about eccentrics in regards to injury prevention and getting the brain to communicate with that tissue more effectively. Is that potentially because like you can overload the eccentric? Yeah. So is like they didn't really discuss overloading the eccentric in the article, to my knowledge, when I read through it, but you know they have that, what's that machine right now, like the EXX flywheel or whatever. Yeah, my chiro, Dr. Ray from Dynamic, put me on that bad boy a couple times, and it sucks, but everything is overloaded in it. So like it's like, think of it like a cable machine that you pull it, and when you pull it like a row or a dumbbell row or a cable, like a seated row, it's the tension that you give, it almost gives it to you back twice fold, and you can't hold on to it. Like you can't sit in the back swing. So it's like constantly overloading that eccentric.
Those were made for space. So in the space race, they started learning really early that athletes, when you take them out of loading, because
you told me this, but go on.
Yeah,
it's a good one.
When you take them out of loading and they don't have anything that's on their bones or on their muscles as far as challenge, because they're weightless,
there's no gravity,
their bone density changes incredibly quickly, and so does their muscular strength and ability, right? So they atrophy like crazy. And the astronauts that they first sent up, when they came back to Earth, they were a mess. So Eric.Berge was involved with the space race, and he's one of the guys that's credited with flywheel technology. But what they discovered is, when they first sent them back up, they gave them isokinetic machines, so it would be like push this hydraulic out, pull this hydraulic back, so it was all concentric.
Yeah.
And it almost didn't stop the changes that they were experiencing.
They're still losing muscle,
like
still
tons.
Bone density is dropping.
So they made flywheel technology for astronauts so that they could have an eccentric contraction, and they stemmed a lot of it. They stopped it. And so what they discovered is a lot of the metabolites and changes that happen, adaptation into exercise, is in the eccentric phase. Yeah. It tends to be way stronger, like up to 40% stronger than the concentric, meaning the lifting phase.
Yeah.
So can you get your brain to respond faster? Yeah, you can get the brain to really kick in, because that's the zone of deceleration. That's what saves you, right? So there's a reason that you're stronger there. So flywheel technology is a great example of, the eccentric is super valuable. And isometric in the end range is what you're going to use first, because you don't have control there when it's just passive. Eccentric, because it's stronger, to get your brain to understand what it is. And the last thing that you start adding is your concentrics and liftoffs, because then you actually have some strength there to work, right?
Yeah.
So this is a very vast oversimplification, but sometimes, when we talked about this for a long time, both you and me are like, well, okay, I don't just want to put out into the ether, well, this isn't what you should do. I wanted to put out, like, this is what you do. So literally, I talk to my clients all the time about, okay, here's what we find first. We find awareness, okay? We access something. And then we're going to build control, figure out what that control looks like. And then on that control, we start building performance around it. And that is a mainstay in almost all the training I do. And that's where rehab and performance training overlap. That's where my Olympic lifters and my back pain clients, their programs are very similar, because we're developing the ability to control tissues.
Yeah. And I want to, even for myself as much as for any potential listeners, I want to kind of like paint a word picture on like why biomechanics, or like how you actually execute and set up the exercise, is so important. And an easy one for me to think about anyways would be like a hamstring curl. Like a seated hamstring curl is in a position where you can almost get a full stretch or a full lengthening on the hamstring, whereas like a lying hamstring curl, where you have less hip flexion, like your legs are no longer bent at the hip, like in a prone hamstring curl where you're lying down, you're not going to be able to get your hamstrings at like a full tilt stretch, full lengthening, correct?
That's right. But the other thing is, like, exercise selection is a big deal for sure, and the other end is execution. So like the first 15 degrees from straight leg to bent is mostly gastroc,
your
like calves.
Yeah.
So your hamstring really doesn't start kicking in till about 15 degrees.
I didn't know that.
So if we want to bias the hamstrings and actually work the hamstrings, we can do a few things. We could work through the range and stop before that 15 degrees. In fact, if you want really sore calves, go to a hamstring curl and only do from straight leg to 15 degrees over and over. Your calves will get smoked.
Well, I knew like my calves were getting smoked when I was doing Nordic curls. But I just assumed it was just because that entire chain was getting tugged on really hard. Like, I was like, man, that whole chain's just getting ripped apart. So, like, it makes sense that, that's all kind of working as a team. But, yeah, I'm assuming the Nordic curl has some effect on the gastroc.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Especially from straight leg, that first 15 degrees.
Yeah.
That's why it's so good for the knee, because the gastroc and the hamstring crisscross in the back of your knee, and they really give it some support.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but let's say you did a nice slow first 15 degrees and then speed it up. That's going to bias the hamstring more. Let's say you do a full rep and then just a partial without the 15 degrees. That'll bias the hamstring more. So that's a simple execution thing that doesn't really change the exercise much, but it totally changes the exercise.
Yeah.
So these things, talking about here's how you would build control in a zone that you don't have, or let's say it's a zone that you already have but you don't own. Figuring out how to control those ranges better is going to give your joints more support, and then you're going to find that you get less tight muscles. So there's this kind of overlap that I see between FRC and N1, whereas N1 is talking about here's how you target a specific muscle so that we can move through its full range, which is going to make the joint happy. FRC is more like, okay, let's do our controlled articular rotations, our joint circles. Let's establish our end ranges with pails and rails, progressive and regressive angular isometric lifts or loads, sorry. And so they're really going joint level, whereas N1 is going more, let's figure out how this muscle moves the joint properly so that we're not giving it undue stress in vectors that it doesn't need.
Yeah. We're going to have to wrap this up real quick.
Yeah.
A summary for me, though, is like, all of this is so new. Like you said, they haven't like done many studies on like FRC and things like that as of yet, because it's a relatively newer system.
Yeah, you're not going to see too many studies on like controlled articular rotations, but we've gone through a bunch of the studies on proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, which is what they call pails and rails.
PNF.
So lots of PNF stretching is well backed.
Yeah.
Eccentrics are well backed. This is actually a meta-analysis that we're looking at of many studies.
Yeah.
And then isometrics are well backed. One of the only contractions that really doesn't cause inflammation, joint level.
Yeah.
So when you put it all together, it actually has a ton of research behind it, and that's why it came into being.
Yeah.
But all of it put together, what does it do for the athlete versus just one? They haven't done a lot on that.
Yeah, so that's where I was going with it. Is I read a meta-analysis this morning that was talking about like what's better, like stretching, like static stretching to increase range of motion, or strength training, and it went over like 50 different like researches from different universities and stuff, and it's like the conclusion is they both kind of work a little bit, some better than others, and all the tests were a little bit different. Like, we're not 100% sure. Like, for me, there's just never been this is 100% the perfect answer for the entire population. Everyone go get fit now.
Yeah, I don't think that that's ever going to be the case, because you need to treat people like a number of one. You need to treat them as an individual, and they're going to have different answers based on their own limitations. But I find it really interesting in the fitness world. There's people that are like, oh, it has to be functional. There's people that are like, well, it has to be isolation. It's like, the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? Like, if you used both of them for their most value, it's kind of like Bruce Lee, man. Take the most value and leave behind the stuff that doesn't have any. Like, that's... If we used that more, we would see a lot better results with people.
Do you want to rename the podcast Somewhere in the Middle?
Somewhere stuck in the middle with you.
Well, do you want to summarize that at all, or do you think you're happy now?
End of the day, when it comes to mobility, there's a lot of stuff being spouted out there, a lot of random activities that you see. First thing is assess what you need. The next step is control and strengthen that zone. You don't want to just get to the point where it's like, well, I have that range. And so we can do that with, our passive stretching, with our active stretching. We can do that with isometrics, eccentrics, and then full movements. But at the end of the day, all of this needs to be put together in a way that you know what you're going after. And when that happens, that's really where the results are had, in my view. Have you experienced any different there, Mr. Berge?
No, I was going to wrap it up differently.
Wrap it up. I want to hear it.
Because I already feel like we did a good job of summarizing it. So I'm like pretty much...
Give me a wrap up. I want to hear it.
Yeah, well, are you good? You done?
I'm good. Wrap.
All right. My wrap up is obviously You can catch Fitness or Fiction every Monday morning on our audio podcast, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. We're also on YouTube. That releases typically around 9 a.m. And it's really important that everyone knows Curtis absolutely hates static stretching. So make sure to leave him some comments in the YouTube and light him up on Instagram for being a static stretching hater. And we love you guys, and we'll see you on the next episode. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate your support.
If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you would subscribe, follow, and throw us a like on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts.